Good morning, my name is Noah Nyforth, and today I'll be talking about civil disobedience and its effects on civil rights. Civil rights have been an issue since the beginning of the country. The U.S. has always had an issue with debating who to give rights, whether it's to be to vote, to own land, to be free. People like racial minorities have been affected disproportionately than others. Women have been disproportionately affected, and so it's always been a debate who to give rights to. And so civil disobedience, acting against a government's actions and wishes and laws in order to go for a purpose, is what we'll be talking about. That leads me to my question. How has disobedience against governmental actions allowed for greater rights for racial minorities in the United States since the beginning of the 20th century? Many different tactics of disobedience have been used over the U.S. relatively short history. Minorities have used all sorts of demonstration tactics in order to strive for more equal access to rights, and racial minorities are a perfect example of a demographic that has successfully used demonstration to advocate for said greater rights. The civil rights movement is probably the biggest example of this. It is the most well known in the U.S. and has been taught since it occurred. The civil rights movement was a large social campaign for advocacy for rights of African Americans. It had a lot of prominent figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. Is shown here, and had a lot of prominent tactics such as sit-ins is presented in the top left or top right picture. It started mostly in the 1950s and continued to the late 1960s, but still has some offskirts happening even today. The civil rights movement was well known for many reasons. It is well known because it was one of the biggest events in history. It was one of the first civil rights movements to actually create change, and it created it gave a lot of new people rights that they didn't have. Segregation was a big thing originally, where they separated people of color between schools and different buildings, where even water fountains were separated. This changed after the civil rights movement. Enough civil disobedience happened. They went on protests, they did sit-ins, they did all sorts of things to go against governmental actions to where they caused change. Eventually, one of the first court cases that happened that allowed for desegregation was the Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated schools. The next movement was the American Indian movement, which still is a movement to progress greater rights and equality for Indian Americans. This one was not as well known, it isn't as well taught in schools. However, it's still a prominent movement today, as American Indians have always been a disproportionately affected group. Since the beginning of the country, they have always been disproportionately affected by racism and discrimination, and so many Native Americans have just tried to fix it. In this, one of the most prominent examples of civil disobedience actually succeeding in the Indian American movement was the Covell Settlement, which was a lawsuit against the government for many crimes they've committed against Native American peoples. They took stuff from their land, they didn't give them what they were supposed to, what they agreed upon, and so they sued. And they as stated in this quote from the excerpt from Eloise Cobell, A Small Measure of Justice by Melinda Janko. The Cobell settlement included $1.5 billion for members of the class, $1.9 billion for a land consolation program, and $60 million for a college scholarship fund for Indian youth. It provided a lot of money and gave a small supplement for what was done to the Indian Americans. The George Floyd protests are probably the most recent example of these movements going on. In 2020, a black man named George Floyd was murdered by police in a case of police brutality. This caused a large protest and large demonstration movement against police brutality and racism. In this photo, it is a protest with George Floyd's face being prominent in it. The George Floyd protests continued until 2023 when it generally slowed down. However, some offskirts of general protests of police brutality and anti-police sentiment has still occurred. No major national reform was made, but there was some local, city, and even state legislation passed for police reform. This also changed social sentiment again for racism. It made people more aware about racist things they may say, and generally caused more awareness for racism and police brutality. For my conclusion, I believe that all of those examples I just gave, whether it be the civil rights movement, the American Indian movement, the American Indian movement, and the George Floyd protests, they are all examples of civil disobedience that have succeeded in promoting civil rights for individuals. Even from the few examples of movements and a series of demonstrations given, it is clear to see that the power to make change through civil disobedience, racial minorities are only some of the few demographics that have benefited from demonstrations. The power to create change, not just socially, but throughout the United States of America, is not just up to policymakers, but is also up to the people of the nation. If there is an injustice, citizens have the right to make their voice heard. And this is my work side. Thank you.
All right, 2 questions for you, Noah. First up, what evidence did you gather that you didn't use, and why didn't you use it?
Most of the evidence I gathered, I used in some way. I didn't use in my paper. I didn't use directly some of the evidence I found, just because it talked generally mostly about the George Floyd movement. It talked about background, and it talked about how, some of the examples before the George Floyd incident happened.
All right, and what advice would you have for other researchers who consider this topic in the future?
This topic is interesting as it's ongoing. It will continue as there is injustice in the world. I'd be careful on what sources you choose, because a lot of sources are very biased towards one side. Some of the sources I saw were very leaning towards the police side, how it's not an injustice, and ethics could get in the way of actual facts.